Welcome everybody, it's Todd Costello of Remax Center Realty. It is April of 2025, time for the monthly value message. This month I want to spend some time on what I define as minimum standards. Minimum standards both for the consumer, buyers and sellers, but maybe more important, minimum standards for the service provider, for the agent that you choose, for the realtor that you choose. So throughout a transaction, I have developed policies and procedures kind of like an operating room or a military operating theater. There are certain things that must be done every single time, and there are other things that should never be done. Minimum standards, things that will increase the probability that my clients will have success and reach their goals at reasonable market values, both for sellers and for buyers. So today I want to talk about financing. There are minimum standards, things that when I'm representing buyers, they're really non-negotiable. I want my buyer to be in the strongest negotiating position, and these are the things they need to be aware of. And for my sellers, they may be less involved on the minimum standards that I'm applying to their transaction, but nonetheless, behind the scenes, these minimum standards that I'm acting on to protect my sellers reduces their risks and typically gives them a better outcome. So let's jump in. Financing minimum standards, both for the agent and the consumer. Number one, you're a buyer. Regardless of the market conditions, a couple of years ago we had a very competitive situation. You were competing against multiple offers. But even when you're not, your job as a buyer's agent is to put your client, your buyer client, in the strongest possible negotiating position. So what I always recommend to clients and almost require is they get a pre-approval letter if they're going to get a mortgage from a local reputable lender. Well, why is that, Todd? Because I want the seller and the seller's agent to be comfortable and confident that my buyer can perform based on the offer we're submitting. Even if they're not competing, I want the seller to be confident in my buyer's ability to perform. So if in my career representing sellers, if I get an offer from a buyer, or we get multiple offers, and the offers are similar, and one buyer has a pre-approval letter from a local reputable lender, maybe that I know, not personally but professionally, and another buyer moving here from Wisconsin or Arizona, and they lived there for 20 years and they have a pre-approval from their bank in that state, I don't know that banker. So the level of detail in receiving an offer from a buyer that has a pre-approval letter from a Center County lender that I've interacted with before puts my confidence level as a seller's agent through the roof. So for my buyers, I want them to be in that position. I want the seller and the seller's agent to be confident in my buyer's ability to act, and we'll be able to negotiate a better terms for my buyer client. So a local pre-approval letter is vitally important. Second, I want my buyer clients to have a full pre-approval, not a pre-qualification letter. The difference between a pre-approval and a pre-qualification: a lender will take your call on the phone and they'll ask you a few questions. And based on what you tell them only, they will say, sounds like you're qualified, I'll email you a pre-qualification letter. Okay, and in many cases that could be somewhat legit, but it's not confirmed. It's just based on verbal communication. A pre-approval letter is more detailed. The buyer's credit is checked. Maybe their credit report is reviewed. So a pre-approval letter puts a buyer in a much stronger position to negotiate, number one. And number two, if you go through the full pre-approval process and you're a buyer that wants to be competitive, maybe your dream home comes on the market and it's vacant, and you're competing with someone else, and the seller's house that's vacant, a quicker closing is going to appeal to that seller. Well, a pre-approval means you've got a lot of the legwork done for your mortgage approval. A pre-qualification, you're starting from scratch. So for many reasons, having a full pre-approval will put the buyer in a stronger position, give the seller more confidence, and really allow the buyer to be competitive on a wider array of homes, and close quicker if that offer to the seller is going to be a benefit to the seller. Buyer closing quicker is better. So having a pre-approval is a lot better than a pre-qualification letter. Mortgage commitment date goes back to the pre-approval. When you submit an offer as a buyer, you are signing a contract, and in the contract on the mortgage contingency, it has a mortgage commitment date. And the contract says that the lender must provide that mortgage commitment by that date. So if you start with a pre-qualification letter and the seller accepts your offer and you're the week before you go on vacation, you don't get the lender the documents they need to approve your loan in time, you could lose the property over that if your lender can't meet the mortgage commitment date because you didn't act quick enough. So for these reasons, when I'm a buyer's agent, these are things that my buyer clients must know on the front end, and I really won't act without it. And that's very important. So you have to have a buyer's agent that's going to have minimum standards so you are in a strong position to act. Sellers, verbal confirmation. I've been doing this for 25 years. And this is a nuance that I represent my seller clients with. When I receive an offer from a buyer, from a buyer's agent, I'm representing the seller. There's a pre-approval letter, there's a pre-qualification letter. Even if it's from a local lender that I know, I still, 100% of the time, I call the lender and I say, hey, this is Todd from RE/MAX. A buyer client of yours is making an offer on my listing. I just want a verbal confirmation that this is good. They are the buyer's lender. They're not going to give me any personal information, but 30 years of experience, I know how to listen. So when the loan officer says, oh yeah, Todd, they're rock solid, they're highly qualified, and it's a local lender that I know, I'm good to go. But sometimes you hear something different. Yeah, Todd, it looks good. Yeah, it looks good, it sounds good, it's probably good. Well, that's a red flag. If a local lender just says it looks good, that would give me a moment's pause. I want to ask some more questions because I don't want my seller to accept an offer and then have to put their house back on the market, which leads me to number 2, back on market. That's increased risk. So when it comes to having a seller agent represent you, you want a seller agent that has minimum standards, that has screening techniques and screening protocols and procedures to minimize the chances that you're going to accept an offer from a buyer that may not be able to perform or perform on time. So verbal confirmation, I do it every time. I don't accept an offer for a seller on behalf of a seller client without getting a verbal confirmation from the lender. And the reason is because you don't want your house to go back on market. The National Association of Realtors 2 weeks ago updated some stats, and nationwide they said that 14% of homes that go under contract come back on the market. I don't want one of my clients to be one of the 14%. Let's get it sold, let's get the transaction and the process done, and let's get it closed. Finally, appraisal support. When I'm a seller's agent, this is vitally important. When I'm a seller's agent, especially coming out of a hot market, and the market is softening a little bit, it's perfectly healthy, it's fine, but it's not as hot as it was, buyer makes an offer and the lender requires an appraisal. Well, the only opportunity that the seller has via their experienced agent that knows this is I prepare a file for each one of my listings with supporting documentation to support the sales price. And those are comparable sales, that's property upgrades, property information, and maybe some sales that were off market that the appraiser might not be able to find. So I provide the appraiser, before they go to the property to do the appraisal, supporting documentation, because if a property doesn't appraise, that is usually the seller's problem. But once it doesn't appraise, we have some issues. So I like to get ahead of that and make sure that we don't have any appraisal issues. So those are just some simple fundamentals when it comes to minimum standards for your agent to be acting on 100% of the time for your benefit as a buyer or seller. Look, for buying side, lookers do it their way, buyers do it my way. People that call and want to look at a property, hey, I want to look at that property, I don't do that. You have to go to the bank. You have to get pre-approved. You have to understand what the process is. So it's important to have minimum standards if you're selecting a buyer's agent. And for a seller, your agent needs to know what you don't. And these are the things we talked about. We need to get a verbal confirmation. I need to hear it from the lender that the buyer's solid, not just in some generic letter. So we avoid these pitfalls. The bottom line with this whole financing minimum standards is competency requires minimum standards, and success requires competency. So this is the message for this month. Share it with people that you know that are actively selling and buying this year. I'm available for questions. You can go to toddcostello.com, and I'll see you next month.